Hi, welcome to Green TV. I am pleased and honored to have my next guest. Carter Dillard is a man of wears many hats. He's an animal rights activist. He's a litigator on climate issues, which is most interesting. He is an author. He is a professor of law, and he is a lecturer, and he worked for the Department of Homeland Security and Justice Department and all kinds of interesting things in his background. But most recently, he is a whistleblower. And that was revealed in a recent essay in Newsweek magazine. And that got my eye. I love whistleblowers. I love people who are courageous enough to call out the truth when it needs to happen. So without further ado, welcome to Green TV and Meet the Solutionaries. Thanks for being one of them. Solutionaries, that is.
Thanks so much, Betsy. I'm really honored to be here.
So with that varied background and with the movement that you started, Justice as a Fair Start in Life, that's the name of your book, and the Fair Start movement that you began. What led you to becoming an activist that is saying the environmental movement, sort of the big environmental, establishment, if you will, is not being aggressive enough in fighting for the rights of animals, that it's too much of an anthropogenic perspective, if I understand, and not ecocentric enough, and not fighting enough for the critters out there that have no say, certainly don't know what's going on, must be wondering if they could be, and how they are being endangered, and how that endangers all of us, really. But I think your focus is particularly interesting because you talk about the Children's Trust movement, and I interviewed Alex Loers years ago. He was one of the early students, young people who came forward with this very compelling argument that you're destroying my future. And of course, now we have Greta Thunberg, most famously. And so that enough is compelling that yes, children have a right to say you're killing my chances of having the life you grew up with and were lucky enough to have and took for granted. But now you're talking about even the next level of that. So tell us what got your attention about what's wrong with this picture.
I'm actually sort of fast forward to today as to why it matters so much, and then I can tell you how I got involved originally. Because when I originally got involved, we didn't realize the stakes were as high as they are. But what is clear is that even small increases in world temperature, average world temperature, 1 degree centigrade or so, have horrific impacts on children's health, maternal health, neonatal development, and prospects for those children in life. Even small increases in world temperature can trigger feedback loops, ecological feedback loops like methane releases in the Arctic that we might lose control of. So the bottom line is what we have done to date and what we plan to do is vastly insufficient because we're already suffering incredible harm based on the changes we're seeing now. So it's absolutely an emergency situation. The reason that I think there's a very specific solution to the problem that is being ignored, one that wouldn't displace other solutions, but could be additive to those solutions, just simply added to the list. We call it a fair start in life as the overriding human right. That sort of brings me to how I got involved in this. I began research in about 2005 when I was with the Department of Justice around family policies around the world. I was doing that work as part of the US government's policy in response to China's family planning policy. And what I found in my research at the time was pretty disturbing. In the middle of the 20th century, the human rights movement had come up with a vision of family policy that more or less said, family policy should be based on parental autonomy, whatever parents wish to do. They could bring children into the world in terrible conditions. They could bring 10, 15 children into the world. There's no obligation for society to redistribute to give children a fair start, give them an equitable start. And that policy is what fundamentally created the climate crisis. It didn't leave room for the non-human world. It destroyed biodiversity. It didn't ensure equality among children. Didn't do anything to protect democracy because it didn't ensure children were born into conditions where they would develop things like critical thinking skills. So in 2000, I published the research in 2008 saying, look, there is clearly a human right to nature, to a restored natural world. And one way to get there is by investing in family planning so that we have more sustainable and equitable families. And between 2008, when I published that research, and I suppose today my appearing on your show, that research and the findings have been largely ignored, and in some cases hidden, intentionally hidden, by a lot of interests that simply don't want to pay for children to get an equitable start. And they certainly don't want to treat nature as non-human liberated habitat, because that's how they're making money, by treating nature as a human resource. So I guess I'll end by saying I think it is a critical emergency situation now. We got here because of the way that we see future children and the environment that they would live in. And I think the way we see it is completely wrong. And there isn't a clear solution to that mistake. And the only question is whether it's too late.
So this organization that you were lead counsel on recently, Animal Legal Defense Fund, or ALDF, versus the US, are they the organization that you're blowing the whistle on because they backed off?
As I said in the article, the information given by the organization for withdrawing the litigation. First of all, the litigation was brought to solve all the problems that I'm talking about. So if you believe in animal rights, animal welfare, animal protection, the first thing you might want to consider is, what should the environment look like? Well, if you take an anthropocentric view, which is the environment is just a human resource for our use, that's not very good for non-humans. It's completely inconsistent with animal rights. So this case put forward an argument that there is a human right to nature, biodiverse, restored environment. So that was the reason we brought the case as an animal rights case. Using that standard, an animal rights standard, a liberation standard, is a much more aggressive approach to the climate crisis than something like the Paris Agreement or an anthropocentric approach that allows 100 or more parts per million emissions. The other part of the case that was crucial is people say, well, it's really pie in the sky to think of this world filled with biodiversity and nature, not liberated non-humans, liberated animals. And that might be to change family policy. So one thing the case said is part of this process involves changing our family policies so that we use child equity, not necessarily parental autonomy, but children's equality of opportunity as a standard for family planning. And if you do that, if you redistribute well so that children are essentially getting a fair start, like if you were to take Cory Booker's baby bonds, where poor children get trust funds, $500 in a savings account that might mature over 18 years. If you took that program, you cut off all benefits for wealthy children, and you use the money to quadruple or quintuple the benefits for poor children, you could change the way we plan families to make them more sustainable, probably smaller, and more equitable. And that can ensure climate restoration, biodiversity, and true animal rights. The case is meant to solve the problems I've been discussing, the failures of social justice movements like animal protection to succeed. And the case was withdrawn shortly before oral argument because of pressure from establishment organizations that have been using anthropocentric standards. So, I mean, the bottom line, Betsy, is it is a whistleblower because I don't think it's possible to have achieved any sort of social progress using anthropocentric environmentalism and ignoring children's right to equal opportunity. But that's what we've done for decades. The case was meant to solve that. It was withdrawn because those things are a challenge to the establishment. They're established to profit margins. And so I wanted to come forward and say, the case is withdrawn because it's a threat to the establishment, not because it wasn't a good case. And we do intend to refile it at some point this year.
And where did our Children's Trust organization play into this pressure to withdraw?
Well, first off, it's an organization I have a lot of respect for. I mean, they are the vanguard in litigation, brought a series of cases over a span of time that's incredibly impressive. I mean, as a litigator, I have a lot of awe for the work they do. But that approach, something consistent with the Paris Agreement, one that doesn't involve redistribution for child equity, and one that doesn't use a standard of liberating non-humans in this biodiverse world or climate restoration, that is, I think, irrefutably what you would call an anthropocentric standard. But there is an alternative. There is an alternative view. And quite frankly, deep green ecologists and some of the more radical environmentalists for 30, 40 years have been saying we weren't doing enough. This alternative approach is called ecocentrism. It focuses on the interests of non-humans. And what you find is if you do that, if you go to that level, right, so you don't look at nature as how can we extract this resource without doing too much harm to humans? If you look at nature as this is their world and their basis for autonomy, you protect the environment at such a level, such a high level, it would have probably, and we have research we're publishing, gone far to prevent the climate crisis. So this approach, ecocentrism, can be litigated. There are theories of why the US Constitution, in fact, is based on a libertarian view of nature, freedom in nature. And while I love the work that Our Children's Trust does, the reality is that they did not like the ecocentric approach and essentially pressured the organization working to dismiss the case shortly before oral argument. And as I said in my piece, the information given by my organization for the dismissal was inaccurate. The last thing I'll say about you is the worst thing we could do is just assume the establishment and anthropocentric approaches to the environment are all that there is. That's not true. There are anthropocentric people and ecocentric people. The two don't see eye to eye. And at this point, the ecocentric argument won. Given what's going on with the environment, we should have done more. We could have done more. And I think if it's not too late, it's time now to use ecocentric and child equity approaches to policy in order to make a drastic turn.
Well, the truth is, if we do a lot more to preserve our ecology and reverse course, it will be good for everything and everybody. And exactly. that really encompasses everyone, humans and non-humans alike. This reminds me, of course, of the ecocide movement, Stop Ecocide movement, and nature's rights, and also rewilding. Where does this fit into those seemingly parallel efforts?
It's a great question. This litigation, which argues that the U.S. Constitution, one that reflects an international human right, is based on this idea of personal autonomy, which really means the right to be let alone. And you might think of what would that really mean? I mean, so you might think of it, well, I can terminate a pregnancy with that right. I can stop the government from coming into my house without a warrant, my right to be let alone. I can stop the government from surveilling me. Those are all important. But if you think about the climate crisis, the really important right to be let alone is I'm in Yosemite enjoying a snowy day. I don't want Exxon's board reaching into my world and melting the ice, raising the temperature, wiping out the wildlife. I'm not let alone. And, there's an argument, it's a very legal argument that, well, Exxon's a private actor and the US Constitution deals with government. That's true. But what we showed in the case is the government is absolutely aiding, abetting, and ensuring that Exxon can do what it does, including through the use of public lands. So there's plenty of argument that the US government is complicit in violating our right to be let alone in nature. So there's an argument that you can get to a restored ecological future, which is consistent with rewilding the earth. It's consistent with ensuring rivers, forests, parts of the ocean enjoy rights as rights of nature. It does something very specific that's different and that precedes those things. And it has to do with the pronoun that's in all of the things that we barely see, or I think you had said a few times, Betsy, what you all are doing to save the planet. That's sort of amorphous pronoun that the people that are on in the world today, we have to account for how they get here and the trajectory for who will be here in the future. We have to account for family policies.
It's a very interesting twist, the right to be let alone. I like it. It's clever. It's a jujitsu move, really.
So it sets us up for those movements because it ensures the we is consistent with rights of nature. You can't have a we that balloons to 14 billion massively hungry consumers and then assign some river a right and pretend it's going to work. And you can't, what's clear is that almost over a third of the emissions reductions efforts in the past few decades through changing how we live, using different technologies, changing our diet, been undone by population growth. The world clearly didn't take the right course when it comes to family policy. So one thing the case also does is it ensures a right to nature where humans policy or family policies ensure smaller, more sustainable populations in the future. And that enables the rewilding, that enables rights of nature, if that makes sense.
Yes, we just have a couple more minutes left. So I want to ask you a couple of things about recent developments, very recent. One you just submitted a filing at the UN. Tell us about that and what you expect to happen, hope to happen. And also just further proof in the last week that Exxon knew in a big way. And how does that impact your efforts?
Yeah, absolutely.
At all.
Yeah, absolutely saw that. Well, so the Exxon disclosure is pretty, we've targeted, the Fair Start movement has targeted that as a key bad actor in this process based on what they knew. The filing in the UN really makes, I think, the argument that we were making in our constitutional litigation complete. And that is, and it deals, in fact, with the Exxon, what we know about Exxon now. If you look at the list of human rights, traditionally, theorists would say, well, there's no particular order to the list. We could start with speech, we could start with autonomy, women's autonomy, it just sort of list them. One thing Fair Start does is that's inaccurate. You would actually have to start with the first right would be the right that accounts for how the people got into this system. It would be the right to have children or family policies. And if you properly interpreted that right, it would have to exist in perpetuity. So past generations couldn't have 8, 9, 10 children, and therefore, young women today have to worry about having one. Past generations would have abused the right, therefore violating the right of women today. You would have to interpret it in a way that it could be enjoyed by all generations to bring children into healthy, safe conditions in perpetuity. And that was never done. And so what we say with Article 6, we filed with the United Nations, citing Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, saying you need to interpret the right to have children as the first and dominant human right, and you need to ensure it lasts in perpetuity. One thing it does is a first and overriding human right. It is the first right. It precedes and overrides property rights of those people who are violating children's right to a fair start. So our argument before the UN is, look, I know the government thinks it should be suing Exxon. There are a lot of protesters that are targeting Exxon, but the reality is human rights say that children who are suffering in the climate crisis are owed compensation and reparations. And we don't need to ask the government's permission to take Exxon's money. Exxon does not have a property right that overrides children's right to a fair start. We can take the resources that Exxon created by lying and by externalizing all their costs on the environment, and we can use that money to issue reparations in the form of family entitlements and planning entitlements to future children. That's a human right. Now, how we get it done is another matter. But as a matter of logic, it's irrefutable.
How about stopping the subsidies to the oil companies? Wouldn't that be a good place to start in 2023 as the glaciers melt and California floods and Lord knows what, is coming up next? Just
perfect. It's a perfect
wait 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a perfect place to start.
So I don't know if you have children, but my baby daughter just got married and is hoping to start a family with her husband. And of course, I want nothing more, especially as the mother of only one. I was busy with my radio career and got a late start, but she's my everything. And I didn't have to think about the future of the planet when I was lucky enough to get pregnant with her. That was a couple of decades ago. What do you think when you read stories here about young people who would otherwise love to start families but are afraid or feel it's irresponsible given what's going on with nature? And that makes me, motherhood being the greatest experience of my life, incomparable, so sad and so mad that things
you've really hit it on the head, Betsy. It is existential to humans to have these relationships, but because of what I mentioned in my research, had shown as early as 2008, and I published in the Yale Human Rights and Development Law Journal, the right to have children was interpreted in a way that just ensured unsustainable growth in order for governments and companies to make a lot of money on that growth. It was never interpreted in a way that it could be enjoyed throughout our future by everyone to have that experience, because they did so sustainably and they did so in a way that was equitable. And so what I would say today, and we say in our petition before the United Nations to young women, is your rights were violated. Your rights were violated by very specific entities that lied in terms of how they developed their policies. They said things like the right to have children is personal and private. Well, of course it's not. It's interpersonal. It's not private. It's very public in terms of the impact of the past. But they said that it was private because they didn't want to redistribute the wealth that children deserve at birth to give equal opportunities. They lied to hide that wealth. So I would say to young people, yes, your rights were violated. Everyone has a right to a biodiverse, natural, healthy, safe world and to equal opportunities in life. Now we just have to find the pockets of the concentrations of wealth and power that collected that money by lying and by not respecting that right, and use that money to bend the arc towards a better future. That's our right to do that.
And I shouldn't bring this up with just a couple of minutes left, but the hypocrisy of right-wing Republicans who don't vote for any action on climate change, but they fight for, fetuses. They want those to be preserved, future humans, and yet they don't seem to care about the quality of life of those future humans when they're aborting the possibility of all life on the planet with their inaction on the climate crisis.
That's it 100%. I mean, I think that there's a great philosopher named Joseph Raz who passed recently, an Israeli scholar, but the view was the worst thing in the world today is this idea that freedom is you can do whatever you want to do. And that freedom for a lot of conservatives might simply be, we want to preserve our communities of wealth and privilege, people having large families, because that's something we want to do, and we have free to do whatever we want to do. People that refuse to wear masks in a pandemic would be under this misperception of what freedom is. And that vision of freedom, instead of things like the absence of human power reflected in things like nature, or freedom because we're all in a level playing field, we're free from each other's undue influence. The old version of freedom, which is do whatever you want, is a massive threat to real freedom. And so part of what Fair Start does is to say free people will target these concentrations of wealth and power to restore a world in the future that looks green, natural, biodiverse, healthy, and where children get equal opportunities in life. And there's a very specific set of metrics under the Children's Convention for doing that.
Carter, we're going to have you back because I have so many more questions. I started a Don't Be Fueled Mothers for Clean and Safe Vehicles campaign back in 2002. And why are moms who love their kids driving around in these, bloat-o-mobiles, gas guzzlers, while we went into Iraq, and just the consciousness around that. So then we have the pandemic comes along and people think they have the right to not wear masks, not get vaccinated. Those personal decisions have a very big public impact that may not be obvious to everybody now, but will be. So it's like those of us who know too much think like, why is that okay? I live in Texas. They're driving around, huge pickup trucks and one person always, and all kinds of other things that are not good for the planet. They're proud to, have a gas guzzler, not just Texans, but I see it more than I did when I lived in the Bay Area. It's like, that's not okay. I mean, why should that be allowed to? It's, Americans' rights and individuality and all that good stuff. But anyway, we have to close. So thank you so much for being with us. And we'll have you back because this has opened up a lot of interesting discussion topics. Really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you for having me so much, Betsy. I really enjoyed it.
And good luck with the filing and your essay. I hope we get word out so more people can read it. It's very thought-provoking at the very least, and very right on and very timely. Thanks so much.
Well, I'm honored by the work that you do. And honestly, I would have never done the work that I do without sort of inspiration that you've created over the years. And I'm just honored that you would have me on and inspired you're doing this work.
It was, you had me at hello. As soon as I read about your background. Thank you so much. And you keep up the great work. We'll be in touch. That does it for this edition of Meet the Solutionaries on Green TV. And we really appreciate you telling everybody again, only those who eat, breathe, or drink. Everyone else can go about their business, about our program. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We promise we're going to start live streaming and we can expand our content and output exponentially. So please help us do that so we can help you.